History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 177, Shakespeare's Worldview, a conversation with Dr. Kay Daly. For today's guest episode, it is a warm welcome for Kay Daly to the podcast. In our conversation, Kay took the opportunity to give an overview of Shakespeare's worldview, as seen through his earlier plays and particularly the comedies. As you will hear, we strayed a little into some of the later plays, but Kay's thoughts seemed particularly useful at this point as we are about to move away from the earliest plays and onto Shakespeare's new and very different experiments in comedy. I hope you enjoy the conversation and find it useful as a kind of summary of what I've covered so far on the podcast in respect of Shakespeare. Kay Daly is a writer, novelist, book and theatre reviewer, teacher and public humanities advocate. Since earning her Ph.D. in English literature from Northwestern University, she has written for a variety of publications and organisations, including the Chicago Review of Books, TimeOut Chicago, the Metropolitan Opera, WNET New York Public Media, the Library of Virginia's blog UnCommonwealth, Dramatics Magazine, and Centerstage Chicago. She also teaches adult enrichment courses focusing on arts and humanities at the Newberry Library in Chicago. Her debut novel, Wilton House, based on the life of the 17th century writer Lady Mary Wroth, will be published by Regal House Publishing in 2027. So Shakespeare's early career was dominated by the comedies and the history plays, and we can see in the history plays how he crafted history to relate to his current political situations in England and in the English relationship to continental Europe. So how do you see his worldview reflected in the early comedies?
I would say, well, first of all, I'd like to start off with kind of an overview of what Shakespeare's worldview was, in my view, then maybe go through the genres and talk about how I see them coming forth. So the way I see it, Shakespeare's worldview is a very optimistic one. When you go through the body of his work, a through line is that he has a belief in an ideal world. There's a sense that there's a way things should be and that it's achievable. So it's an idealism, an optimism, and the idea that when you look at a traditional value or a traditional world order, that there really is a there. There's something you can get to. So when you look at his various genres, say if you look at the history plays, they revolve around questions of what is right governance, when can a ruler be overthrown? A ruler, of course, is anointed by God, so this is a big deal if you're going to make that change. So looking back at the history of England, Shakespeare is puzzling out what do we make of these various moments of upset, which were legitimate, which were illegitimate, and what was the fallout in terms of the world order. And you see a similar thing, but through a different lens with the comedy, because the comedies tend to begin with an unsatisfactory version of that ideal world order. So if it's a patriarchy that you're looking at, which it will be because it's Elizabethan England, it's one that's out of balance. So, for example, if you think of A Midsummer Night's Dream, where the men are so dominant at the beginning and the fathers are determining what the daughter will do, and you've got Hippolyta, who's been conquered by Theseus, and the retreat to the woods is an opportunity to rebalance it. And when they come back, there's reunion, there's happiness, there's joy. So there's this idea that you can get closer to that ideal, and that the comedy is working out how you do that. It's doing a number of other things, but that's kind of the big picture I'd like to emphasize. And I'd like to actually give a little counter to a play that I hope to get to talk about a little bit later, of just Troilus and Cressida, which is kind of Shakespeare's weirdo comedy that nobody likes and nobody wants to do anything with, because it's such a digression from his typical pattern. It's the closest to Jonson, I'd say, that Shakespeare ever gets in terms of emptying out the notion that there can be an ideal. He takes this classic story of the Iliad and basically just empties it out in terms of who has authority and is it legitimate authority. You see Odysseus through the lens of somebody who is kind of just a blowhard and a trickster. You see the emptying out of romantic love. Everything is just kind of scorched earth by the end of it. It's an oddly not funny comedy in that way, and very much, as I'm trying to describe, it's very much a doing of something very different than what Shakespeare does, particularly in his romantic comedies. And then just to sum up with tragedy, the way I see it is, it's the golden age is behind us. There's been a great fall, and what has happened is that any ideal existence that we had is blasted and gone, and the closest you get to any kind of sense of an optimistic, forward-looking play that's a tragedy is Macbeth, which interestingly has the connection to the king. So it's kind of like, oh, look, centuries hence, we will have this order restored by somebody who we can believe in, somebody who's rightfully anointed by God. So that's kind of my overview of how I see both comedy and the other genres kind of playing out Shakespeare's ethos.
So if there is that signature style, as you put it, let's talk about those early comedies then, because everyone who's listening will hopefully be familiar with those because I've talked about them fairly recently. And they're not always the easiest things for us to get on with, I think, because they come with layers of understanding that we need to a degree to get to appreciate them fully. So why don't we pick the Comedy of Errors to start with?
Yeah, it's interesting to consider Shakespeare's comedic trajectory, because in these early plays, you tend to see kind of a groping toward the style he's going to get to, and he's trying on a lot of things. So with Comedy of Errors, it's like he's trying on the Roman comedy mantle. So there are elements that you will see come up later, but as a comedy, it feels different from his more mature comedies in that it's much more slapstick. It's much more farcical. But then he also wraps the whole thing with the romance framing, which I know you commented on in discussing that play. And romance is where he'll go eventually. And I feel like romance colors Shakespeare's notion of comedy, and that he is looking for a grand reunion, a grand restoration, and that's what the romance genre is about. So it's interesting that he takes this kind of lightweight Roman farce and then wraps it with this semi-tragic story of a family divided who are then kind of magically brought back together, which is what we'll see at the end of his career. That suddenly becomes the meat of what he's doing. So yeah, that's how I see Comedy of Errors. That's the only way it has a connection to where he ends up going with his comedic forms.
So would you say that's a case of the young playwright sticking to his source material more closely than he does later on? So it's less his own sort of play?
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. It feels almost apprentice-like, that he is picking up the tools he's been given and seeing what he can do with them and doing some really wonderful and fun stuff with them. But one wonders if the romance wrap that he puts around it indicates he's not quite satisfied with it yet.
Yes, enamored with Plautus, but maybe not quite there in his own mind yet.
Yeah.
So then we have to talk about The Taming of the Shrew next, probably, which I freely admit is my least favourite of the comedies, along with many other people, I think. It's another play set in a rather fantasy world.
Yes. It's it feels oddly, it's contemporary to Elizabethan England, but it's set in Italy. So it's got that touch of an exotic world that is not England. So you get a little bit of the feeling of the comedies that are to come, where he so often sets them off-site. They generally tend not to be in England. They tend to be in Europe, often Italy, sometimes France. So they're somewhere else. And he does have a riff on what will become the mainstay of his comedies, which is that sense of the blocked lovers. But in this case, the blocked lovers are the secondary characters. It's actually Bianca and her suitors, and Bianca's desire to be able to marry the man she loves. That becomes the precursor that then takes us to the central action, which is the taming of the shrew. You see later on a similar decentering of the classic comedy trope in Much Ado About Nothing, where there is the hero and Claudio romance that gets blocked, but really the interest of the play is around Beatrice and Benedict. So it's like Shakespeare sets his template and then plays with it, and it definitely feels like he starts to be more experimental in this play. I know you talked about the induction in Taming the Shrew, which I think is a strange and interesting kind of innovation. I don't think we'll ever understand what that was quite about, but it's interesting to consider that he was playing with meta-theatrical devices, which is something he does a little bit with. When we later look closely at Jonson, you'll see he does a lot more of that in terms of setting this off as a play, having the playwright actually come out and talk to you about how you should receive this play. Shakespeare does some of it. He doesn't get quite that radical. I think it's also interesting to consider that the shrew is a sort of stock character, a stock figure. And I think Shakespeare always plays with stock figures. I think the drama of this time, the comedy in particular, goes back to those stock figures often. I think as Shakespeare progresses in his career, he begins to humanize them more. I think it's up for debate how much humanizing we see with Kate. I know I've heard comments on the play that see a lot of subversion in the way that she is written and presented. I don't quite buy it personally. And the thing I would like to point out is that in as much as there is somewhat of a celebration of Kate as this outspoken independent figure, if you think about how the play concludes, her taming isn't entirely just defanging her. It actually is channeling her original boisterous, independent, pugilistic nature, but toward restoring the norm, which is men are in control. So her taming is a rechanneling. So it ultimately is this very conservative, bring it back to the values we all agree are important, which is that the man rules the household, the king rules the country. If you have an outlier like this, you just make use of her to support the status quo.
It's really fascinating to look at these early plays as a progression, and as much as we have trouble placing exactly what order they were written in, I think generally, exactly as you are doing, we can suggest some development in Shakespeare as a playwright. And perhaps the next interesting one to come up to is Love's Labour's Lost, which is a very different sort of play from much that's been written before.
Yes, Love's Labour's Lost is a really interesting outlier. And I personally have a really deep scholarly interest in Petrarchism and the courtly love poetry of the period. So for me, this play has always had kind of a special place in my thinking, because it's such an interrogation of that tradition. And Shakespeare interrogates that tradition throughout. He does in his love poetry, in his sonnets, and then he does in plays like Love's Labour's Lost and Much Ado About Nothing, and I think really tellingly in As You Like It, where you see these detached pieces of verse and how they get handed around and whether or not they reflect reality and whether they're a pose. But the thing I find really fascinating about Love's Labour's Lost is that while we see some of the seeds of his more mature and what I would call classic Shakespearean comedy, like As You Like It, is that he kind of hasn't, it's not that he hasn't gotten there yet, he's finding ways to interrogate that. And what happens in this early play is that he kind of empties it out once again. He's not settled in resolution. This may have something to do with the referentiality of the play, because this is a notoriously hard play to read it's so referential to the times that you kind of are clinging to the footnotes sometimes to understand what people are talking about. The characters actually relate to real life characters. There are people in France that it's referencing. It's talking about the situation with the royal family, with the Duc de Navarre, various other characters. So it's rooted in the real world, say in the way that Johnson will do later in the lived experience, in a way that Shakespeare doesn't do typically with his comedy. So it's got these interesting parameters about it. But ultimately, what I find fascinating is that it is a true inversion of his typical comedic form in that it doesn't end with resolution. It doesn't end with a marriage. It ends with a death, and it ends with a going of separate ways. It almost feels like it ends with a to be continued, in a way that the more mature comedies end with, and now we're done. And now everybody's settled into the right order. It's a declaration of, we can't get there yet. And it's in part due to the incompetent wooing of the men involved through this poetic tradition. And it's in part because of the interruption of the real tragedies of life. So it's very interesting. I think it's a quasi-watchable play. It's not fun and uplifting the way that the other comedies can be, but it's fascinating from an academic standpoint.
Okay. In the timeline-wise, we just jumped over Midsummer Night's Dream there, which, of course, is one of the most watchable plays Shakespeare ever wrote, probably. So what's your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, Midsummer Night's Dream is, I feel like it's the text of what Shakespeare is playing around with as he is developing his comedic style. It's, it's this classic setup of a society that's kind of off kilter. It's modeled on the tradition, the traditional conservative values of how a society should be run. It's unsatisfactory for characters, so they escape. They go into the forest. Amazing mystical things happen that cause them to kind of up-level in their development. And then they come back and they are able to enter a new phase of life. Everybody in there has had a transformation. And I think this gets at the core, ultimately, of when Shakespeare is kind of running on all cylinders and kind of in his stride, is that he treats comedy as a ritual representation of the move from adolescence to adulthood. And I think that ritual approach says so much about how he views life, that there are these phases that we all go through. I mean, later in As You Like It, you'll hear about the 7 stages of a man's life. He has this view of, we all go through these things, and something has to mark when we move from one stage to another. So you see it with the young lovers. You also see it with the rebalancing of Titania and Oberon. You see it with Bottom, whose speech I love so much, and who knows what actual impact that, but something transformative happened to Bottom in this. He has his wonderful speech that I know you discussed about the parody of Corinthians, which I've always found such a gorgeous speech, because on the one hand, it's laughably wrong, but on the other hand, there's some kind of deeper meaning that when he's trying to grasp at what he experienced, he has to reach to synesthesia. The senses do not match up. It's not ear has heard, it's what, I can't remember the exact words right now, but he mixes up the organs of sense and what they deliver in a way that is both comedic, but also really transformative and otherworldly. And so it's nice to think that Bottom is he's translated. Bottom thou art translated. And everybody in the play is translated. And I feel like that is the thrust of the mature comedies.
Yeah, it's interesting that Midsummer Night's Dream is one of those where there's no real source for the play.
Right.
So he's, this is, as you said, I think just then, pure Shakespeare. Yeah.
And that when he doesn't have a plot to kind of transform and recreate, that this is the pattern that he recurs to. And that he imposes maybe on the sources that he later looks at.
Just to balance things up. The other play without a source is The Merry Wives of Windsor, which obviously written as a comedy. Now, when I discussed it quite recently on the podcast, the good part about it I found was the way it is a play about language, and particularly about English and Englishness. But there's not an awful lot else going on in there, apart from it being a sort of rustic city comedy. I take it you would agree with that assessment, pretty much.
Yes, I 100% agree that it has a completely different feel. I chalk it up to the fact that this wasn't a play, at least according to the lore, that he plucked out of his brain, but rather he was given an assignment. That Queen Elizabeth wanted more of Falstaff. Give me another play about Falstaff. So he basically creates the conditions where Falstaff can just kind of run wild and be made a fool of. None of the plot seems to matter much. It doesn't do much for the people involved. You do see a rebalancing in that, see, I care so little for this play. I can't even remember the characters' names. The main lady gets to kind of rebalance her marriage. Yeah. But yeah, I it feels like an add-on. It never feels like it's central to his work.
But Falstaff as a character, especially in the Henry IV plays, would you find something more in him?
Yeah, well, he's a wonderful character and so much richer than the typical clowns that you get in Shakespeare, because they tend to be like, they're just silly, or they're just ignorant, or they're just overblown in their sense of themselves. They're a little flat in terms of people, because of course the comedy is more about the situations they're in and what they make of them. Falstaff, because of his trajectory in the history plays, gets so much deeper and so much richer, and his relationship with Hal has so many interesting shadings, particularly if it's seen as a counterpoint to Hal's relationship with his father. The other thing that I really love and I feel like makes him so important to that play is the sense of anarchy he brings, and the sense of supplying something that Hal would get nowhere else in the play, which is a counterbalance to life as ruler, a deeper understanding of what people on the ground are thinking, and also some strategic moxie. I mean, Falstaff is good at working a situation. He's a wonderful creation. Yeah. I feel like when I look at characters like that are comedic characters, I feel like I need to make a distinction between a comedic character and a comedic genre structure. Right. So those are two distinct things. So you're never going to look at a history play and see a comedic structure, but you're going to see wonderful comedic creations.
Okay, so that brings us quite nicely to The Merchant of Venice, which obviously a comedy, technically speaking, but and it has this rather unfunny clown in it. So what are we to make of that in terms of the signature style?
Yeah, I was giving this a lot of thought because it's a very urban place. So you don't have that sense of escape to the forest, but it does have an element that I think gestures towards Shakespeare's understanding of how comedy functions, and that is the scapegoat. Obviously, Shylock is the scapegoat in this play. We see other scapegoats. We see Malvolio in Twelfth Night. We see Jaques in As You Like It. And this touches on an ancient pattern of the way that a society rebalances, gets right with God, cleans itself from its past sins, is that it loads it all on a goat and runs it out into the forest. And you see Shakespeare doing this with Shylock, who becomes all the evils of capitalism. That Merchant of Venice is so much about capitalism. It's about a merchant. It's about how do you deal with capitalism versus traditional Christian values of charity and generosity and mercy. And so you have this Jewish character who is loaded up with all the stereotypes of anti-Semitism of the day. He's humanized, but he's not that far from, say, Barabbas in the Christopher Marlowe's Jew of Malta. He's still got those signature pieces. He doesn't get killed, but, he gets exiled. He gets defanged. He gets blamed for all the evils of capitalism and pushed out. So in a way, you see Shakespeare grappling with a new mercantile structure to culture and how do we get right with God when we've now got this competing ethos. We send that evil thing out, and now it's all about love and marriage and happiness and restored friendship.
Yes, getting right with God. So as much as each of the comedies are quite innovative in their own way, overall, they're actually quite conservative and non-threatening in that sense.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's a very conservative worldview that he is supporting. It's all about asserting patriarchy, asserting a hierarchical society, and doing it in a way that makes everybody seem like they're happy with the status quo, and that the status quo is actually always was the best way, is the best way now. And if you need reform, it's to get closer to the ideal of that status quo. It's not to disrupt it or reform it or question it. It's about reinstating it. And I feel like there's an element in the comedy, in Shakespeare's comedy, that always makes me a little uncomfortable, which is that with his clowns, he tends to punch down. It tends to be lower class people who are either shown up for being very stupid or very venal, or for thinking they're above their station. You see that with some of I think it's the constables in Much Ado About Nothing.
Yes.
And the language work in that is tremendous and so funny, all the malapropisms. But there is that sense of, oh, look at this little man thinking he has power. Let's mock him. And so that's a part of Shakespeare that I'm not entirely comfortable with.
Yes, I was thinking of Malvolio in that case as well, because of the terrible fall he has because of his ambition.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to think. So he fulfills the role of the scapegoat, which I described earlier, because he is excised as somebody who cannot fit in this structure. But also, you're right, he's an upstart. How dare he? How dare he think that such a fine, grand lady would ever look at him? And isn't it funny that we set him up to believe that? And then we have to mock him and send him off stage. I find that deeply unfunny, but that's me.
So we get to a point where I'm at in the podcast at the moment, got up to Love's Labour's Lost, and I will be carrying on. So of what we've discussed so far, As You Like It is coming soon, but looking a bit further ahead than that, just to give us a taster of what is to come in Shakespeare's later career. Comedy still plays a major part, but they are very different comedies from the ones we've discussed so far.
Yeah, I think what we see in what I've been terming the mature comedies is that we see more of a settling into that sense of restoring an ideal world order is the thrust. And where that tends actually to the end of his career is toward romance, which is a genre that I think is confusing in terms of its label to those of us in the modern day. We tend to think, well, wasn't As You Like It a romance? It's like, well, no, there's a different terminology at play, because when we talk about Shakespearean romance, we're actually talking about the ancient world's tradition of romance, which were these stories of separation and reunion that have kind of a magical glow of resurrection. In fact, I saw it written somewhere that the ultimate romance in Western culture is the death and rising of Jesus. That it's like, you lose this great thing, but all will be restored. And it's kind of a pattern that humans yearn for, and that sense of a golden age returning. And so that's what you see in the romances that come later, in The Tempest and the Winter's Tale and Cymbeline. You see that there is a world order that is broken, and then you bring together the elements and you bring back the dead in some cases. Particularly in the typical romance trope of a child who is lost and recovered. Like, that's the ultimate romance trope. And you see it with children being put in chests into the ocean, and then later they meet their parents. It's kind of the happy version of Oedipus, where it's a happy reunion. It's not a terrible reunion. And I think a wonderful opening out of Shakespeare's original interest in ritual and phases in life, because if we talked before about comedy as the up-leveling from adolescence to adulthood, and romance, you see like the ultimate reunion of the family. So looking at something like Winter's Tale, which I know you'll cover later on, but, sneak peek, it's a tragedy that is healed by comedy and even breaks down the middle. So the first half is tragedy and everything is destroyed. People get killed. People seem to get killed. Spoiler alert. And then it breaks and it's years later and it's a different season and it's a classic blocked love story. But what comes out of the blocked love story isn't just a repair, it isn't just the bringing together of the bride and groom. It's also the bringing back the dead wife to the husband. It's the reunion of the family. It's the healing of what all is lost. It's bottom thou art translated. You've got this original form, but now it's deepened. And it's extended to the entire life cycle. And it's interesting to think of something like the romances coming after King Lear, which is such a bottoming out of hope and a loss of a golden age that kind of once Shakespeare gets to that end point, the only place to turn for hope and optimism is to the romances.
Well, what a very nice hint of things to come there. My thanks to Kay for taking the time to talk to me today. The good news is that Kay will be back in a couple of episodes' time to discuss Ben Jonson's plays and help us understand his worldview and some of the key differences between Jonson and Shakespeare. But before then, and next time, we return to Ben Jonson with a look at his humorous comedy Every Man Out of His Humour, regarded as a close relation to his previous comedy Every Man in His Humour, but which is not a direct sequel. In the meantime, if you have not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.